right. So, based on the feedback from everybody, I was just kind of watching as it was coming in. Obviously, we have to address what's going on behalf of drivers. And so, if you look at the stats right here, we've got charging network should own it. Whoever wants to install that thing should own it. Electric utilities, government, automakers. So, my question is the first thing we think about is, well, what is the problem? And so, first, I want to throw this to Camille from Charger Help. The work that your company is doing is instrumental in really focusing on where the pain points are. And we actually have a really good visual. It's kind of wonky, but we have a good visual to show basically how this all works behind the scenes for a driver. And you'll notice this is kind of, just this nice flow chart, but every little red dot you see is, well, Camille, I'll let you explain it further.
Sure. Well, first, thank you so much for having me. My name is Camille. I own a company called Charger Help. We fix electric vehicle charging stations because they break. It's a thing. And really, it comes down to like three core reasons, Matt. The first, which since we have this lovely graphic here, has to do with how complex it is. So what folks may not know is that a lot of charging infrastructure they're IoT assets. So they are essentially computers that we've deployed all over the place. And in order for you to have one successful charge, all of those orange lines on that graph has to properly communicate data and information. And so what we have seen is that because the gray boxes are different companies, sometimes the information is not properly communicated. Or if you had a firmware update or a software update, it's hard to understand what the other entity is really asking you to do. So that is a huge issue. And then the other two, I'll say pretty quickly. I think that, I love the question because today we really don't know who should be responsible for O&M, right? So if a car, a car is experiencing an issue on a charging station, should it be the network provider or should it be the car OEM? And then the last piece really has to come down to funding. Fixing stations costs money. Yeah. That's why I have a company. And so, who will pay companies like Charger Help to go out on site? So one, it's a pretty complex issue. Two, it's hard to identify whose fault it is. And then three, where will this money come from?
Yeah, again, and this chart, it represents a lot of different stakeholders that, to your point, have to collaborate, have to communicate. But from a driver's perspective, each of those little red pain points, they don't exactly know what pain point it was. All they know is, I can't fill up. And so to that point, if we're looking at it from a hardware perspective, a software perspective, a communication perspective, all those different touch points really doesn't come back on the driver really, it comes back on that collaboration. So to that point, I'd actually like to ask Emily, so if we're looking at this from the perspective of what is the problem and how do we solve this, do you think it's more of a matter of collaboration? Do you think it really is a sense that we need to simplify the process? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I'm an EV reporter for PC Mag, so I spend a lot of time talking to people who own EVs, looking at the market, and just kind of getting a pulse on how it is. And there is one thing that's working very well, which is home charging. So 80 to 90% of EV charging is at home, and that's where EVs really shine. So I was talking to a friend, and he's really gung-ho about EVs, and I was like, why are you so into it? And he said, my EV has changed my life for the better. I'm an executive, I have 2 kids, we're driving them around constantly, and not having to go to the gas station has made my life better. And so that is really working well. But the problem is kind of when you venture outside of that, it breaks down pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So this is kind of more of a public charging situation. It takes a long time to charge, 30 minutes to an hour on a fast charger. No one wants to add that to a road trip. And then recently I've been interested in apartment charging. I live in an apartment, and at that point, it's the decisions on the property manager to decide to add EV chargers, to justify that cost, and then to manage who gets power and when, how do they pay for it, how does it connect to the meter,
right.
How do you make sure that one tenant isn't always using, the spot. And then a lot of them are setting even their own electricity costs for what their tenants pay. So they're becoming like a business within a business. And there's just a lot of issues outside of the home charging, and I think that's like the next frontier.
Well, and to your point, a lot of that home charging that can be done at home for homeowners, that's only about 50% of the United States. So we still have over 100 million people that inevitably that might be driving EVs still have to go find their fuel, and they're going to potentially encounter those little pain points. And again, they're not going to know which pain point. They're just going to say, I couldn't fill up. Yeah. So I guess to that point is asking another question. Do we have the right strategy for how we're rolling this out? Is that schematic we were looking at of all those different stakeholders and touch points and all the potential pain points, is that just going to become a Frankenstein's monster of problems? I mean, is that the case? I guess, so Elsa, to you, what are your thoughts on how we could potentially improve the strategy, or do we have the right one?
Thank you, Matt. So I'm Elsa Yu. I work for Southern California Edison, the local utility here, and I support all of our e-mobility programs here at Edison. So to your question, do we have the right strategy? It's definitely a very interesting question, because here it's almost like we have so many strategies out there. There's so many stakeholders in the market throughout the whole EV customer journey. Everything from policymakers all across the nation, to your local governments on the city level, to your utility company who provides the power, and finally to the site hosts who have so many people they have to work with. They have to work with their hardware manufacturer, their network worker. They have to work with a guy who installs a charging station. And they have to work with someone like Camille's company to maintain and operate, or maintain the charging stations. So the strategy, from a strategy standpoint, it's almost like, how do we coordinate all these stakeholders properly to make sure all these guys are getting the best experience possible?
But is that happening now, do you think? Or based on the evidence, maybe it isn't?
So I will say right now, we are definitely in our infancy stage, and everyone seems to still be figuring things out. So from my perspective, I think that there's a lot more coordination that's needed. From an Edison standpoint, we are getting the grid ready for all the EVs that are coming our way. But the next step is, are our policymakers ready? Are our local governments ready to get us streamlined permits on time? Is everyone else ready to provide the materials needed to get to market quickly? There are so many players in the market, and my big concern is, are we doing everything while thinking of the final driver in mind? Is it the most convenient for them? And also, are we doing it equitably? That's another question. I mean, we have EVs, they have a reputation of being the car of the rich. So how do we make sure that on the policymaker and the utility side, that we make sure that everyone comes up and electrifies in an equal fashion?
Well, and to your point about having the driver in mind, I mean, this is where, frankly, where Zeal is working on that specifically. So I guess my question would then be to Xander, how does this conundrum get worked out on behalf of the driver based on, is it one company that can help steer the ship and guide the other stakeholders in a way that could be proper? What do you think?
Well, I like to think about this like one of those mazes when you were a kid. You know, you would go through the lines and get there, and then when you're, maybe 7 or 8, you found the trick and you would start in the center and you would work backwards. So when I look at a diagram like this, I look at the root issue, and that's that big orange square. When cloud computing came out, it wasn't meant to support critical infrastructure like EV charging. We have a single point of failure that's needed for payments, to turn the charger on, for demand response. So I think we have to look at it and be okay that we built it on the wrong system. And that's kind of where we come into the market. We built a distributed ledger technology, which eliminates all of those pain points, where the phone carries a token. It could be on airplane mode. No IT, no internet, no cell service, no transaction processor, no internet connection, to make it a lot easier. So when Camille goes out to support these chargers, not only can she help and maintain a reliable network, but she has a cure for some of the problems going on in the market today.
Well, and I think what we're also seeing with kind of how that schematic looks and all the stakeholders that are involved is there's really 2 things in mind. One is that drivers need to have access to electricity to fuel their cars. The other is there has to be a viable business model on behalf of the stakeholders that are working on it to actually make this something that they can build out. This can't just be something that is, just out of nowhere. There has to be an ROI for those who are invested and involved. So to that extent, I think this is something that kind of I thought of as I was hearing the responses is, if you think of a dummy charger, you remove a lot of these aspects, but then you also don't have any insights into what's happening on behalf of the driver or the energy being used, et cetera. So is that consolidation that you were talking about of all these different pain points that can go away, does that obviously solve for the ROI for the business side, where they can actually have a capitalistic approach to saying we can build this out and it's going to be a good business model, but can it still solve the fact that there's still that interconnective problem of, okay, we still got to communicate and it can break? Is it as magic as you say it is?
So it's still connected, it's just connected a different way. It wasn't until 2019 that the phone could bidirectionally communicate.
Yeah.
Distributed ledger sending information between devices instead of to a server on the other side of the country is pretty new. So the economics in that model, it doesn't support a profitable business.
Yeah.
But when you remove the network fees and you're still networked in a different way, I think then the economics make sense for everybody, including the real estate and other stakeholders.
So we're building out basically a new schematic of how it can and should flow, essentially, right?
Yes, but at the same time, it's not fun to be disruptive if it doesn't fit for everybody.
That's also true.
So it should be built on common systems as well.
Yeah. Well, and yeah. Oh, Camille, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was gonna, to my colleague like Seal and even a lot of new folks coming into this space, it has been pretty exciting to folks like iterate on how, like, the end goal, right, is for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And within our space, right, it is to drive mass EV adoption or other sustainable measures. And so I've just been excited to see the new ideas, right, that are coming forth and that are disruptive and thinking about things differently. Is the other thing folks may not know is, like, some of these companies have been around for 16 years.
Yeah.
Right? And so there is a time right now where we need innovation. We need to look at what isn't working, right? And then how do we move forward with better solutions? So it's actually very exciting. It brings a lot of joy to my heart, Matt.
Well, what also makes me think of what's happening is we obviously have pain points, and we need to resolve those. We also have a lot of investment happening from even the federal government we're going to build out, hundreds of thousands of EV charging stations. Is that going to work with this model? But you said the innovation has to happen. We can innovate during, what everybody's thoughts on this? Can we innovate during that process, those dollars being spent? I guess, Emily, what are your thoughts on how this will end up serving the driver, that we're investing billions of dollars into this? Is there a thought that this might not, for the non-homeowner, is this actually going to work out?
Yeah, I think there's a big challenge with consumer education right now, and as a reporter, that's something I work on every day, is how do we communicate this clearly? It's very confusing. There's 3 levels of charging, level 1, 2, 3, they're different speeds. And I find that the car companies, when they advertise a new car, it's hard for a consumer to know, like, what their charging needs will be, and how to make good on all this investment. Do they need a level 3, a 2, a 1? What will they have at home? And then the metrics that these car companies are saying are they're trying to sell the car. So they'll say it charges in 35 minutes, 45 minutes. That's on a public level 3 fast charger. It doesn't happen at home.
And not every level 3 is the same.
Exactly. I know that's your thing. I love that.
Yeah, I'm going to say it every time.
Yeah, and they'll say the highest kilowatt hours. So they'll say 350 kilowatt hours it'll charge in 35 minutes. But that will take 5 hours at home on a level 2, which you have to pay to install. It'll take 12 on a level 1 that comes with the car. So it's hard to set expectations. We don't have metrics for all of that. What's being communicated right now is just it'll take 35 minutes to charge, which is not accurate. And also the range number, everybody knows you will never achieve that exact range, and it will be different in different scenarios. And you only have to charge when you run out of range. So we need more metrics to quantify the charging problem, communicate it to people, and then make a plan that matches what people need.
It almost feels like what we're describing is that we're still at that, again, we're still introducing a lot of people to the idea of using electricity as a fuel. And within that, there's a lot they have to learn. And so the communication aspect is obviously, that's fundamental. And to your point about the automakers, is they, at the end of the day, are selling a car first. Yes. They don't really have a horse in the fuel race. But if there is a fuel involved with that vehicle, they'll do their best to describe it. But it still gets back to, again, who's serving the driver. And I guess fundamentally, it sounds to me like structurally, these pain points have to be solved if we're truly going to get up and run. Right now, we're kind of crawling, maybe baby crawling, getting up to walking. But if we're going to sprint, we have to have some of those innovations that you're talking about. And in turn, it will help with the maintenance side. But then, obviously, from the companies that are going for grants and dollars to spend, again, looking at NEVI funding, things like that, that's where I think of, are those dollars being spent into an ecosystem that is still a little bit too fresh? Are we going to have a lot of infrastructure rolled out that is going to be built upon an idea that may not be the best? Elsa?
Yeah, so I think this is where I think policymakers and your local utility can play a huge part. So I think aside from all the different players we now see entering the market, all your startups trying to sell their new charging products, a group, something like a utility, can help a customer, especially a business or a residential customer, installing charging for the first time, using electricity as their fuel, to sort of figure out what the framework is that they need to do all this, especially in a safe manner. So I think we've talked a lot about, there's a lot of entrants in the market, there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot of safety concerns sometimes. I mean, we look at people and residential customers installing level 2 charging at home, and I've heard of stories where they use a new product and you see scorch marks up and down their garage wall because they're not using a product that's been certified. So for that, a utility is a great source of information for the customer, how to do things safely.
Camille, go ahead.
Yeah, and the other thing I just, want to add from a O&M perspective, and having companies that are like focused on O&M past just fixing things. A lot of what we built at Charger Hope is getting that data and then being able to bring it back to the industry, right? Today, Charger Hope has touched almost 10,000 charging stations across the US. And so we have a good understanding of like, what are those stations that once deployed, they're not doing that well, right?
Yeah.
And what are stations that are doing really well? Because one of the things that we have seen is that a lot of engineers, you spend a lot of time creating things in your lab, but the true lab is post-deployment.
Is in the real world.
Right?
Yeah.
When we start seeing issues, out in the field, it's usually when, a manufacturer gets past 500 deployments.
Yeah.
So some manufacturers are more reliable with smaller deployments, but if they expand too quickly and don't have the necessary things to iterate as they're expanding, you start to see reliability being impacted. But O&M programs such as ours, you can get that data back to the utility and manufacturers so you can iterate faster. But we have to get the data in order to know what we're going to be fixing.
Well, and to that point, that I would say that data then is what translates to policy. And to that point, so Xander, as you were mentioning too, that innovation that has to happen, it strikes me that we're now collecting the right data on the pain points. To that, we can point to where innovation needs to happen. And in turn, that can then drive policy. But to that process and those stakeholders all involved, that doesn't happen overnight. That has to be an extremely proactive collaboration. I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's like launching a new product, right?
Yeah.
Like, you have to expect it to fail. You have to expect to iterate it. You have to expect to say, I was wrong, and then work together to find the best solution. And I couldn't agree more with Camille. That's how you iterate the product. You find data, and you work with key policymakers, and working together to make it work for everybody that has the mass impact.
So one thing that strikes me is there's a lot of opportunity right now for people that are new to this space and new to this industry to get involved, because there is money on the table. And is that going to be a bigger distraction than we think? Is it going to turn into people that are trying to just get into the space? You mentioned home charging and people that are buying home chargers that aren't certified. Just because they look at the cost and they say, gosh, I can't spend $600, $1,000, $1,500, but I'll get this thing off of Amazon or something that I could afford, but it may not be the right thing. That's going to be a problem we see going forward for cost. But then there's also other people that are getting involved with the public charging that may not be installing quality installations. And how do we vet that?
So I think this is a major problem. This is when we talk about installing charging stations. I mean, it's not about a couple $1,000s here. When you talk about installing charging stations, you can get into the millions of dollars per site for a DCFC charging station, a fast charging station. And so with all these entrants in the market, perhaps selling their construction services and whatnot, we need to make sure that maybe on the policy level, there are guide rails in place so that our customers are doing this in a equitably funded way. So you said there's a lot of funding out there in the market. There's a lot of funding to be grabbed everywhere around the nation right now. And there will be people trying to convince you, hey, install your charging stations, we can get you this money now, you're not gonna have this money in 2 years.
Yeah.
But how do we make sure that these folks installing charging stations are also doing it in a sustainable and affordable
responsible way?
So at Edison, like our 3 big things are affordability, awareness, and availability of power. So the affordability part, how do we make sure people are doing that affordably right now?
Yeah.
I mean, like you said, it may take years to figure out how to do this process smoothly.
But at least this is why we're here talking about it. Emily, thoughts?
Yeah, I think something we wanted to touch on was just standardization.
Yeah.
So what we're getting at is just the variation in charging solutions. Whether you buy the $200 charger on Amazon or you go to a fast charger on the highway, like you're paying for the power in different ways. You might go to a public charger and you have to create an account on an app before you can use it, which is more annoying than just a gas station. You put your credit card in. Some take credit card.
Yeah.
If you go to Europe, you can't download the apps in the app store that they have there. They're not available to U.S. customers. It doesn't work on your phone plan. So there's just a huge amount of variation.
Yep.
And the plug types is another one. So Tesla has developed their own plug. Everyone else uses another plug.
So how do you navigate that without getting overly confused and scared?
Right, and it's part of an industry just being young, and probably over time it will consolidate, like we've seen with other tech products and other tech industries, but it's very much an issue right now, and I think we need something to force more collaboration.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it is.
I think these conversations are that. So real quick, I want to put up the poll we had at the beginning again to see who is the audience thinking who should own this. And so, based on my memory, if we can't get it up, it looked like it was whoever wants to install them. There we are. So my question is, based on our conversation today, everything we've talked about, do you agree with this? I guess just down the line, Xander, who do you think who should own this for drivers?
Everyone, but the simple answer is the system. And I think everybody needs to be comfortable with the system working for all stakeholders.
Elsa?
So I do think I don't disagree with this, but I do think there are more players out there that need to create those guide rails to make sure that whoever does own it, like they have the best chance possible of making this a success.
Camille?
Just like I'm gonna say something prerogative. I mean, it's electricity as a fuel.
Yep.
Like, who owns electricity?
Utilities?
Yeah.
Yeah. Emily?
Yeah, I like this. I think whoever builds it should make sure it works.
So to that point, whoever builds it should make it work. I agree with that, because at the end of the day, you're owning that experience on behalf of drivers, and that's at the end of the day what this is about. So number one, thank you so much to the panel. Please.